All right, looks like we're recording again. Okay, so we're going to talk today about section 1.5, which is bias in sampling. Okay? We're going to talk mostly today about surveys. The idea behind a survey is you try to figure out what the public thinks about a topic. Okay? Now, it can be very hard to do because of what we're going to call sampling errors. Okay? Sampling errors are caused by the act of taking a sample. Okay? All right. So, let me just tell you one of my, in fact, I would say, let me put it this way. My favorite statistical podcast is a podcast called 538.com. Has anybody ever heard of 538.com? What? What do you know about it?
I used it for a political science class.
Political science class. It's very good for political science. It's also good for sports. Okay? What else do you know anything about it? Do you know why it's called 538.com?
It's the number of people who, the electoral college. What's it called?
Yeah, so the electoral college. So I'm trying to remember. I think it was back in, I want to say 2012. I think it was Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney. There's 538 votes in the electoral college. They ran a mathematical model to figure out how many votes Barack Obama would win and how many Mitt Romney would win. And they nailed it. They got it exactly right. They got all 50 states correct. Okay? That's hard to do. Okay? So it spawned a website called 538.com because they did such a good job. It's an awesome, they talk about politics, well, they did talk about sports, but I like the politics stuff more. So anyway, they did it again in 2016. They didn't do so well. They did better than everybody else, though. They said that Donald Trump had a 30% chance of winning the election. They said that was about the same probability that the Cubs would come back from a 3-1 deficit and win. And guess what? The Cubs won and Donald Trump won. Okay? So 30% does not mean hopeless. Okay? All right. We'll talk about probability later, this thing. But at any rate, one of the things that 538.com does really well is they rate surveys. So are they good surveys or are they bad surveys? Okay? So they actually compare the survey with the actual election results, and then they say, wow, this is really good or this is really bad. Okay, and they use this in their formula, and they were correct in predicting that Hillary Clinton would win the popular election, but they got the electoral college wrong because they missed 4 states. Okay, they got 93% right. Well, we might talk about that in a future lecture, so I won't give away too much. But at any rate, every single, and it doesn't matter who you are, how professional you are, every single survey is going to have a problem with some sort of sampling error. Okay, there are 2 main types of sampling errors. Number 1 are random sampling errors, and 2 are non-sampling errors. Okay? All right, random sampling errors are caused by chance. Okay? Now you'll notice when you do a survey, well, the good surveys at least, they will always announce a margin of error. And so these random sampling errors are included in the margin of error calculations. Okay? Now there are 2 main types of random sampling errors. A is undercoverage. Okay? And that just means people are left out. Okay? So some people don't have phones. If you're doing a phone survey, it's hard to contact somebody without a phone. It's hard to contact the homeless. They usually don't have phones. Okay? So it's not that you intended to leave them out, you just didn't know how to contact them. Okay? Another one is voluntary response. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. The problem with voluntary response is you're going to get strident opinions. Okay? They're probably going to be overrepresented in your sample. Okay, let's talk about non-sampling errors. Okay? These are errors after selecting the sample. Okay? The most common would be processing errors. Okay? Now the definition I like to use for processing errors would be something like typos. Okay? You're doing a survey on people's weight, you accidentally enter that they weigh 3,000 pounds. That's usually a pretty easy error to spot. You say, oh, it's supposed to be 300 pounds. Okay? Or maybe you're just mistyped, you put they were male when they were female, or vice versa. You just typed it in wrong. That's a little bit harder to catch. Yeah, just basic typos, processing errors. Another type would be, we'll put this over here a little bit. Okay, would be response errors. Two main types of response errors are forgetting and lying. Okay? Now, if I were doing a survey on diet, I think I might have asked this yesterday, but I'm going to ask it again today. How many of you remember what you ate 2 Wednesdays ago for lunch? Should have said breakfast. Some of you remember your breakfast because you eat the same thing every day, right? Okay? If I ask you about that, you're probably going to say you ate more vegetables than you did. And you're probably going to say you ate less candy than you did. Okay? It could be a combination of forgetting and lying. We shouldn't assume that people are always lying. Sometimes people forget. If I were to ask you, and don't raise your hands, but by raise of hands, how many of you have ever done illegal drugs? You probably have a good incentive. I had actually somebody in my last class that raised his hand. He wasn't embarrassed. But yeah, you have a good incentive to lie about that, right? You don't know what I'm going to do with the information. I might get you in trouble. I might turn you into the campus police. You don't know what I'm going to do, okay? If I were doing a sex question, how many of you would like to participate? It was the same guy last time. Okay? So he's an open book. But at any rate, yeah. So on sensitive things, people are going to lie. In the last election, they got a lot of the polls got the winner wrong. They predicted Hillary Clinton. Okay. A lot of people said, well, part of the reason why was people did not want to admit that they were going to vote for Trump. So they lied to pollsters and said something else. Okay. I don't know if that's true. It could be true. So that can be tough. Response errors. I will say this, that skilled interviewers can help. Okay? So I'll give you an example. When I was working on a brain injury study, one of the things that we wanted to know, several of the things we wanted to know, was the person who was injured, did they have a learning disability? Did they have ADHD? Did they do illegal drugs? Did they drink alcohol? Okay. So we would ask them multiple times. We'd have the doctor ask, we'd have the nurse ask, we'd have the social worker ask, we'd have, maybe we would ask a family member, I can't remember. We'd ask them like 6 times, it seemed like, I don't remember. We'd ask them a bunch of times, and so some they'd say, yes, yes, no, no. And you'd be like, wait a minute. They said, yes, they did a little drugs. They told somebody else, no, which one's the right answer? So what did we do? So so our solution was to say, if they ever said yes, yes must be the correct answer. And our thinking was, well, maybe they don't trust the doctor and the nurse, but they like the social worker. So they'll tell the social worker yes, but they'll tell the doctor and the nurse no. Okay? So anyway, skilled interviewers can help to tease out truth on things like that. So another issue is called non-response. Okay? Now it's a little different than undercoverage. Undercoverage means you didn't know, you couldn't even find the person. Non-response means you found them, but they either didn't answer the phone or they answered the phone and refused to answer. Okay? So so they can't be contacted, or refuse to answer. Okay? Now, one of the problems with this is it can be as high as 75 to 80% in phone calls. And the problem is people who don't answer are different than people who answer. Okay? So I'll give you an example. So when I was working on that brain injury study, one of the things that we would do, we would ask them a really long questionnaire. A lot of times these people were really severely injured. Okay? So we would ask them, and it would take like an hour to fill out our survey. Okay? We would do it 3 months after their injury. We would do it a year after their injury. We would try to find out how their lives had improved or not. Okay? We would ask them a lot of questions, a lot of personal questions. Are you going back to school? Are you working? Are you able to walk up and down stairs by yourself without assistance? Are you able to go to the bathroom by yourself? Are you having sex with your significant other? We just ask them a lot of really personal questions. And one of the things that we found was that the people who answered both surveys were sicker than the people who only answered the first one. Why is that? Don't know why, but our theory was, well, somebody who's severely injured, they're not working, they're not back to school, they're really motivated to help us because we're helping them. They want us to tell what's wrong with them and what we can do to help them get better. So they're highly motivated. Whereas the people who only filled out the first survey, they're working. They're back in their normal life. Life's good for them. They don't have time to waste on this freaking long survey. Okay? It's not worth it to them. They're too busy. And so that was our thing. So the problem with non-response is most people you don't ask twice. You don't know why they're not responding, but they are different. Generally, they are different than your responders. Okay? So that can be very tough, especially in a tight election or things like that, where just a few votes either way can change it. Another issue, wording of the questions. Okay. On October 27th, 2017, I got this email. Friend, it was very personal. The president has asked us to reach out to some of our top supporters for a 1-question poll. And as one of our best, you've been chosen to participate. Wow, that was so nice. They're buttering me up, aren't they? Please take a moment to choose one of the options below to answer the following. Okay, I'm going to write the questions on the board. The president's job has been Okay, and they gave me 4 options. Great, good, okay, other. What do you think of that question? Not a good question because?
Because it only gives good options.
Only gives good options. Well, maybe this one, right? It was still in the blank after that, if you picked that one. I did fill it in. Okay, now, most polls aren't that blatantly bad. Clearly, they have an agenda. And so sometimes wording of questions won't be this bad. But seriously, I have it right here. That's the email. You can see. Oh, well, you'll see it on the video if you watch it again. So, but at any rate, yeah. So this was an actual Trump campaign thing. Now, let me just mention this, okay? And I'm not trying to pick on Trump. But I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and I want you to tell me which one's the better question. Or, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't ask it that way. But I'll just ask. So here's the 2 questions, very similar questions. Number 1, how is the president doing? Versus, how is, and then insert the person's name, I'll use Barack Obama. How is Barack Obama doing? Okay? Very similar questions. In fact, you could argue that they're the same question, right? Just with different words. The first question, how is the president doing, will always score about 10 percentage points higher than the second question when you fill in the person. George Bush, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, doesn't matter. The second question will always score lower than the first. And it's just a little psychological thing because the president deserves respect. But not Barack Obama or Donald Trump or George Bush or Bill Clinton, doesn't matter, okay? So sometimes wording of questions, it doesn't have to be this blatantly bad, just little subtle things. How about this? Okay, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. You tell me which one is the better question. Do you oppose the reduction of estate taxes? Okay, that's one question. The second question is, do you favor or oppose the reduction of estate taxes? Which one's the better question? Question 1? Question 2? Okay, question 2. Why is question 2 better? Gives you 2 options rather than 1. Okay? Now, when you're asking a question such as, do you approve or disapprove of the job George Bush is doing? Okay, you should rotate approve and disapprove. So one time you'll say approve, disapprove. The second time you'll say disapprove, approve. You don't want to get in the habit, especially if you have a lot of those questions in a row where you're going approve, 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 approve. Okay, so you want to make sure that you rotate that. All right, now this is another true story. Okay, I received a call from a group called FreedomWorks. Has anyone ever heard of the group FreedomWorks? What do you know about them?
Can't remember a lot. I'm pretty sure they're conservative.
You think they're conservative? Okay. Anybody else? I'll answer that question at the end. Okay. All right. I had never heard of them when they gave me this call. This was about 6 years ago, I think it was. Okay. And so they asked me a few questions. Now, I don't want you to overthink this. Sometimes students overthink this, but I want you to tell me, is this a fair or an unfair question? Okay. The first question they asked was, do you plan to vote? Who says that's a fair question? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It looks like a majority. Who says it's an unfair question? Okay, good. You're not overthinking this. Yeah, that's a fair question. I didn't have a problem with that question. Okay, so 6 years ago, the 2 candidates running for the Republican primary were Dan Lillenquist and Orrin Hatch. So they asked me, are you inclined to vote for Dan Lillenquist or Orrin Hatch? Is that a fair question or an unfair question? Who says it's a fair question? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who says it's an unfair question? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why do you guys think it's an unfair question?
Or they give you any Democrats? They assume that you're.
Well, it was the Republican primary. There were the only 2 running. You gonna change your mind? Anybody else?
You said one name first. And so when you say
Orrin Hatch or Dan Lillenquist. I'll rotate it. I don't care.
I think
You guys are
that's
overthinking it.
Two different questions.
You think that's two different questions?
Or, yeah.
Okay, you're overthinking it. I don't have a problem with that question.
No way.
Okay, that was a fair question. Okay? All right, I didn't have a problem with that question. Okay, so question number 3. If you knew Senator Hatch sponsored a bill similar to Obama on health care, would you be more or less likely to vote for him? Fair question? Nobody? Unfair question? Okay, why? Let's pick somebody else. Why isn't it an unfair question? You said unfair, didn't you? Why do you think it's an unfair question?
It's too hypothetical.
It's too hypothetical? You can't ask a hypothetical question?
You may not be aware of that at all because it's completely false.
Okay. What do you think?
It's comparing Orrin Hatch to somebody of the opposing political party.
That doesn't seem kind of fair, does it? Let me ask you one more question. Tell me what you think. If you knew Dan Lillenquist sponsored a bill to save taxpayer money on Medicaid, would you be more or less likely to vote for him? Fair question? Unfair question? Okay? Pick on somebody else. Why is it an unfair question?
It's kind of the same thing you said. They're trying to convince you to vote.
I'm trying to convince you, right? What's an observational study supposed to do? Observe and measure. This is an example of what we call push polling. Okay? You're no longer trying to observe, you're trying to influence opinions. Okay? It's not an observational study anymore. And in fact, when I called them out on that, they said, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We want you to vote for Dan Lillenquist. Okay? They're a Tea Party organization. They were trying to throw them out. So push polling is unethical. Okay? Freedom Works is an unethical group. They are conservative, but more importantly, they're a Tea Party group. Okay? They flat out admitted they were trying to influence my opinion. They said, would you like to talk to somebody from our campaign? And I said, yes, I want to know who wrote these questions. They're terrible. Do you know I teach statistics at UVU? Now you're in my notes. Okay? As an example of a bad poll. Okay? Very unethical to do that. All right. They actually hung up on me after a while. Okay? So the question becomes, how do we deal with non-sampling errors? Those are errors we have more control over. Now, obviously, wording of questions, I think that one's pretty obvious. You can word questions better, okay? But one of the things we can do is weight the responses. Another thing that we can do is pick other houses in the same neighborhood. Okay? And in fact, that leads to stratified sampling. Okay, we talked about stratified sampling yesterday. Now, have you ever wondered when you're doing a poll, especially a political poll, maybe you have or haven't done one, why do they ask you your age and your income and your race and your gender? Why do they ask you that stuff? Okay, because they're trying to do a stratified sample. Okay? The idea here is, and I'm going to make up these numbers, I don't know what they are, but let's just say that in Utah, you've got 10% blacks and 15% Hispanics and 5% Asians and, you know, I'm up to 70% whites, whatever. Okay? So the idea here is, with a stratified sample, you often, but not always, I'm going to underline often, try to make sample look like the population? Now, I'll give you an example here in a minute of when we don't want to do that, but often that's the purpose, okay? You're trying, so, you know, you might talk to too many blacks and not enough Hispanics, okay? So one of the things you can do is you could weight the responses and you know, increase the blacks, decrease the Hispanics, or whatever. I think I might have said this the opposite. Whatever you do, you're trying to make your sample look like the population of Utah, let's say. Okay, so another thing that we can do, unfortunately, Americans, there's a really good series on 538.com about gerrymandering. I think we all complain about gerrymandering, right? It's actually pretty interesting because it's a little bit more complicated of an issue than I thought about. But one of the problems is, the reason why politicians can gerrymander is because a lot of us want to live by, especially here in Utah, Republicans want to live by Republicans. If you pick somebody in the same neighborhood, maybe the first person didn't answer, the second person's probably going to have a similar opinion as the first, okay? And that's because we gerrymander ourselves. We want to live by Republicans, or we want to live by Democrats, or whatever, okay? And so now they can draw lines around us. If we were less predictable in our voting, they couldn't gerrymander us. If we were, you know, if we were more independent, they couldn't rely on us to be a reliable Republican voter, for example. And so picking another house in the same neighborhood can often be useful because we probably have similar opinions to our neighbors, okay? But we probably ought to maybe not be such a reliable voter with politicians, okay? Now, so I did mention with stratified sampling, we often try to make the sample look like the population, but there are cases where we may choose not to do that. So let's say that a university has 30,000 students, of which 3,000 are graduate students. Okay? You want to do a simple random sample of 500 students. What is the probability a student is selected? Okay. So you're doing a random sample of 500 students, university of 30,000. What's the probability that you get selected? How would you figure that out?
If it's a true simple random sample, you just divide 500 by 3,000, 30,000.
30,000. Okay, which would be about 1 in 60. Okay, so you would have about a 1 in 60 chance of being selected. Okay, all right. So let me ask you a question. How many of those students, of those 500 students, how many would be graduate students? Would you expect? You'd expect 50, right? How did you come up with that number?
3,000, 10% of 30,000.
So 3,000 is 10% of 30,000, so you would expect 10% of your 500, which would be about 50 students, right? So you'd have 50 graduate students. How many undergraduates would you have? 450 undergraduates. Okay. Now let's say you wanted to do a sub-study on graduate students versus undergraduate students. Now, a very simple definition of the margin of error is 1 over the square root of n. We're going to give you a better definition later, but for these exercises, we'll just use this really quickly. Okay. So if I did 1 over the square root of 50, somebody get a calculator, and then 1 over the square root of 450, Tell me what that number is. Who's got a calculator? So 1 over the square root of 50 is 0.14 is 2, I think. And what is 1 over the square root of 450?
400. Oh, sorry. 0.0047.
0.047. Okay. So you're talking about a 14% margin of error, pretty big, right? And a 5% margin of error, right? Okay. So you've got a huge margin of error here. This is actually pretty good here. Okay. So one of the things that I might do, even though I might try to inflate my graduate students. Let's say I did 1 over the square root of 200, and then that would leave me 300 for my undergraduates. What's my margin of error for the graduate students? 1 divided by the square root of 200 is?
Why are you?
I want to lower my margin of error. I've got a 14% margin of error versus a 5%. So I'm gonna quadruple this because I want a bigger sample size. Okay. So 1 over the square root of 200 is 0.0707, and 1 over the square root of 300. .057. Okay, so I've only increased my margin of error 1% there. That's still pretty good. And I've got this margin of error, I've cut it in half. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so there are cases where you say, well, 50 is just too small. I'm gonna bump this up, and so this will still be reasonable, and that's not too bad. Okay, so yeah, you don't always try to make it look like the population, especially if you have something too small. You might want to inflate it, so you can do some more analysis. Okay, all right. So now the last thing I have is questions to ask about the survey. Okay. Number 1, who did it? If it's FreedomWorks, you can discount it. If it's Donald Trump's campaign, you can discount it as unfair, unbiased. Okay. Number 2, what was the population? Okay. Was it all adult Americans, or was it registered voters, or was it likely voters? Okay. Not everybody who registered is going to vote. Okay. So yeah, if it's likely voters, it might be more accurate than all Americans. Number 3, how was the sample selected? Was it a phone poll? Was it a simple random sample? Was it a stratified sample? Was it a convenience poll? Okay. Was it a web calling poll? Okay. Number 4, how large was the sample? Okay, if it's only 50, you're going to have a very large margin of error. If it's 1,000, that's probably more typical. Number 5, what is the margin of error? Okay, a lot of times people ignore that. Okay, if you've got a 5% margin of error that says that, for example, Mia Love is up on Daniel McAdams 48 to 47, that's within the margin of error. It's basically what you would call a statistical tie. Number 6, what is the response rate? It's almost never reported. As we mentioned, the people who don't respond are different than the people who responded. Okay. Number 7, how were they contacted? Was it by phone? Was it by mail? Was it by email? Was it a website? And number 8, what were exact questions asked? Okay, you can see if the wording is bad. Okay, all right, so that's the end of 1.5. So quiz tomorrow on 1.5. We'll see you all tomorrow. I'll post this up on YouTube.
Sure, you have